The storm that night was not the kind you simply waited out. It screamed through the valley like something alive, clawing at the cabin walls until every board groaned. Snow rolled across the windows in heavy sheets, and the wind punched through even the smallest cracks. I had lived through many winters alone in this cabin, but that night felt different. There was a sharpness to the cold, a warning in the way the treetops swayed like dark shadows bending under a force stronger than nature itself. I was sitting near the fire wrapped in the thick old blanket my mother had sewn years ago when the first sound came. A thud, then another, then something that did not belong to the storm at all. A quick, panicked pounding against my door. I froze instantly. I lived in the mountains. There were no neighbors within walking distance, no visitors, no reason anyone should be pounding on my door in the middle of a blizzard. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. The pounding came again, louder, more desperate. Through the sound of the wind, I heard a voice. "Please, someone, help!" My fingers hovered over the handle of the fireplace poker. I grabbed it, clutching it like a lifeline as I stood up. My steps were slow, uneasy. Every warning I had ever learned as a woman living alone in a rural area flashed through my mind. Do not open the door for strangers. Do not trust desperate voices. Do not take chances when no one is around to hear you scream. I approached the door and pressed my eye to the small peephole. At first, all I saw was a blur of white. Then a shape moved. A man, tall, broad shoulders dusted with snow, and something slumped against his chest. A child. The man looked like he was barely standing upright. His head hung low, his breath fogged in short, uneven bursts. The child in his arms did not move. "Please," the man called again, though his voice was faint now. "My son. He is sick. He is too cold. We need shelter. Just for tonight." I swallowed hard as fear tangled with something else inside my chest. I should have turned him away. I should have yelled that I could not help. I should have remembered the way people in town whispered about me, the strange girl who lived alone, the soft and foolish one who never learned her lesson after trusting the wrong man once. But the child, that small, motionless body in his arms, that was what made my hand reach for the lock. I opened the door only a few inches, the wind slamming into me like a wall of knives. The man nearly fell forward, but caught himself at the last second. His face came into view under the porch light. Dark hair soaked and plastered to his forehead, eyes wide, tired, but kind. He shifted to show the child more clearly. The boy's cheeks were flushed red from the cold, his eyelids fluttered. A weak cough slipped out, thin and painful sounding. I felt something twist deeply inside me. "Bring him in," I said before my mind could catch up to my mouth. "Quickly!" The man bowed his head in relief and stepped inside. Snow spilled across my floor as he crossed the threshold. I shut the door behind him and bolted it again, the loud click echoing in the tiny cabin. "Lay him here near the fire," I said, pointing to the old couch. He did not argue. He lowered the boy gently and removed his coat, wrapping it around the child instead of himself. The boy shivered. His lips trembled from the cold. I grabbed the spare blanket from the chair and handed it to the man. His fingers brushed mine. They were ice cold. "Thank you," he murmured. He looked around the small room as if he could not believe he had made it inside. I lifted my chin, trying to sound stronger than I felt. "What is your name, Jonah?" he said quietly. "And this is Micah. He is 7. I nodded once. "I am Mara. If you hurt me, I will scream loud enough for the mountain lions to hear me." Despite the terror carved into his face, Jonah almost smiled. "I would never hurt you," he said softly. "I just needed to keep him alive." The fire crackled behind us, slowly pulling warmth into the air. Snow continued to slam against the windows, but inside the cabin something shifted. Not safety, not trust, not yet, but something gentler, a fragile quiet. Jonah sank to his knees beside Micah, brushing snow from the boy's hair with a trembling hand. Micah's eyes flickered open briefly, just long enough to meet mine. He whispered one word. "Cold." I stepped back for a moment, pressing my hand against my chest. I had been alone for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone in my home, someone who needed me, someone who trusted me, even if only for one night. Something inside me whispered that letting them in would change my life. I just did not know yet whether it would save me or break me. Jonah stayed close to the fire that first hour, tending to Micah with a quiet focus that made the entire cabin feel smaller, as if the world had narrowed down to only the rise and fall of the boys' shallow breaths. I tried to keep myself busy moving around the room with a mug of warm tea I never drank, wiping surfaces that were already clean, straightening piles of books that had been straightened 100 times. Anything to distract myself from the awareness of two strangers in my home and the strange warmth spreading beneath my ribs. When I finally forced myself to sit down, Jonah looked up briefly. His eyes held exhaustion, but also something else I couldn't name. Respect, maybe? Or gratitude so deep it silenced him. "If you need anything," I said, trying not to let my voice shake, ask. Jonah nodded. "You have already given us more than enough." It was the way he said it that unsettled me. Not with the tone of someone accepting charity, but as if he was acknowledging a sacred thing. I opened my mouth to speak again, but he looked down at his son, brushing a hand over the boy's hair with such gentleness that the words died in my throat. For a long time, the only sound was the pop of firewood and Micah's occasional cough. Eventually, the storm outside eased just enough that Jonah stood up and walked toward the door. The sudden movement startled me. "Where are you going?" He didn't touch the handle. "To bring in your firewood." I stared at him. "You don't have to. You're freezing. And exhausted." Jonah shook his head. "You let us in. Let me do something." Before I could protest, he slipped out into the snow. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, confused by the simplicity of it. Men who came to my door never offered help. They asked for it, expected it, took it. Jonah returned minutes later, arms full of chopped log snow clinging to his hair and shoulders. He set the wood beside the fireplace without a word, then paused when he noticed the broken hinge on the hall closet door. Without asking, without even commenting, he knelt down and adjusted it until it opened smoothly. Then he walked into the kitchen, washed his hands, and checked the loose shelf above the sink that had annoyed me for months. I followed him, unsure what to make of any of this. "Why are you doing all that?" I asked quietly. Jonah didn't look up. "Because it needed to be done." I frowned. "You're guests, not workers." This time he did look at me. "Guests," he repeated softly as if tasting the word. "It has been a long time since anyone called us that." My breath hitched. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I felt it, deeply. While Jonah tightened a screw with the small toolkit I kept under the sink, I moved to check on Micah. The boy's forehead had cooled slightly, his breaths evening. I brushed a strand of hair from his cheek and his eyes fluttered open. "Hi there," I whispered. "I'm Mara. You're safe." He blinked at me sleepily. "Your house smells like cinnamon." I laughed quietly. "That's just the old wood. It's nice," he murmured, drifting off again. When I stood, Jonah was leaning against the counter watching me, not staring, not intruding, just observing with a kind of quiet gratitude that made my face warm. "He likes you," Jonah said gently. "Micah doesn't warm up to people easily." "Neither do I admitted before I could stop myself. Jonah's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like understanding. When he returned to the living room, he stopped midway and pointed at the roof above us. "Your vent is whistling," he said. "The snow must be blocking the cap. I'll check it tomorrow. I can check it now." "You'll freeze," I said firmly, "and fall off the roof." "I don't fall," he replied simply. "I've done harder things in worse weather." Something in his tone made me pause. Not arrogance. Experience. I wrapped my arms around myself. "You don't need to prove anything," I said quietly. Jonah looked at me for a long moment. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the tired lines near his eyes. "I know," he said, "but doing things helps me breathe." I wasn't sure what he meant, but I nodded slowly, and he stayed inside. For the next few hours, he kept moving around the cabin as if he'd lived there for years, but always with a kind of restraint, checking with his eyes before touching anything. When he lifted a loose floorboard to secure it, he glanced at me, When he filled the kettle, he waited for my nod. When the fire died too low, he gestured toward the wood before adding it. His presence was careful, respectful, steady. A presence that didn't take space, only kept it warm. At one point, when I walked past him to refill Micah's water, my shoulder brushed his arm. Not intentionally, just a small accidental touch. But Jonah stiffened as if the contact startled him. His breath caught subtle but real, and for a moment the air between us shifted, not into romance, not yet. Something simpler. The beginning of trust. When night came again, I laid out fresh blankets on the living room floor. Jonah started to protest, but I shook my head. "You need rest," I said. "Both of you." He exhaled softly. "Thank you." I turned away so he wouldn't see how that simple phrase affected me. I had heard "thank you" before, but rarely from someone who meant it. As I walked toward my small bedroom, Jonah's voice followed quietly. "Mara." I looked back. "Yes. You didn't have to open the door tonight. I know," I said, "but I couldn't leave a child in the snow." Jonah nodded slowly. Most people would have. The way he said it made my chest tighten. I slipped into my room. But long after I lay down, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind, one thought wouldn't leave me. I had let a stranger into my home. But nothing about Jonah felt like the danger I had feared. It felt like something else entirely. Something I didn't yet understand. Something that did not feel normal at all. The storm softened by morning, but the cold seeped into the walls as if determined to stay. Jonah rose before I did, judging from the faint sounds in the kitchen. When I stepped out, rubbing sleep from my eyes, I found him standing by the stove, boiling water with the kind of quiet competence that made the small space feel safer than it had in months. His hair was still damp from melting snow, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows. "Morning," he said, voice low, careful not to wake Micah, who was still curled under the quilt. "I hope you don't mind." I figured I'd start water for tea. I shook my head and reached for a mug. "You didn't have to." He didn't respond, only poured hot water over a tea bag and pushed the mug toward me across the counter. "I know," he finally said, but it felt right. It was the softness in his tone that made me pause. Most people filled silence with words. Jonah filled it with presence. We ate what I had left in the pantry, half a loaf of bread and a few spoonfuls of jam. Jonah insisted Micah eat most of it. I pretended not to notice that Jonah himself barely touched any. After breakfast, the boy curled against his chest, still tired eyelids fluttering. Jonah stroked his hair with a rhythm so gentle it almost hurt to watch. When I suggested boiling more water for Micah's fever cloth, Jonah's lips lifted slightly. Something like gratitude, something like relief. He let me help. Hours passed quietly. At one point, while Jonah sat beside the fire, rubbing slow circles on Micah's back, I stepped outside to check the snow depth. It swallowed my boots entirely. The back door creaked behind me, and Jonah joined me on the porch. His arms crossed loosely, the wind ruffling the edges of his jacket. "You don't have to freeze with me," I said. He shook his head. I needed air. We stood in silence watching flakes drift from heavy clouds, the kind that made the entire world feel gray and padded. "How's Micah?" I asked. "Better," Jonah said, though the exhaustion in his voice betrayed how deeply the night had worn him down. "He sleeps more than usual, but that's normal." I nodded. Then after a moment, I asked, "Does he get sick often?" He hesitated, looking out over the snow rather than at me. Sometimes he said quietly, "Since..." He cut himself off. Since what I wanted to ask, but something about the way his shoulders stiffened warned me that pushing would break whatever fragile trust we had built. Instead, I stepped back inside and stoked the fire. Jonah followed, setting his coat on the table. When Micah called out softly, Jonah moved to his side immediately. I watched the way his eyes softened, the way his hand steadied the boy. This man wasn't a stranger anymore, but he was still a mystery. Later that afternoon, while Micah slept again, Jonah stood by the window watching the storm settle into silence. I approached him with a fresh cup of tea. "Here," I said, "you need to warm up." He took it carefully, fingers brushing mine for a split second. Enough to still my breath. He sipped, exhaled, then said, almost to himself, "He dreamed again last night." "Micah." "Yes." Jonah stared into the mug. "He always talks in his sleep when he's scared." "What did he say?" Jonah swallowed his jaw, working as if deciding whether to trust me with something fragile. He said the same thing he says every time, he murmured. Daddy don't let her go. My chest tightened. Is he talking about his mother? Jonah nodded once. She used to sing him to sleep. He thinks if he says those words enough, he'll hear her voice again. His voice cracked so softly, I almost missed it. I didn't realize I had stepped closer until the distance between us felt intimate. That must be hard for you, I said gently. Jonah nodded again. I promised her. He stopped abruptly. His breath hitched the slightest bit. He closed his eyes, and for the first time I saw it. The weight, the grief, the thing he carried like a shadow stitched into his skin. Promised what I asked. Jonah didn't answer immediately. He looked down into the mug as if searching for courage there. When he met my eyes again, something raw flickered in his expression. I promised I'd keep them safe. Them. The word hung between us like a small breaking sound. Not just Micah, plural. His wife, his family, the ones he had promised, the ones he had lost. He seemed to realize he had said too much because he straightened, suddenly, stepping back as if he had burned himself on the vulnerability. Forget I said that, he muttered. You don't need my problems in your house. I shook my head, voice steady. If someone brings their child into my home in the middle of a snowstorm, their problems are already my business. Jonah looked startled. Then something softened in his face like a tight string loosening. Not trust yet, but permission. A small, trembling permission to be human. When Micah stirred on the couch, Jonah excused himself quickly, grateful for the escape. I watched him the way he hovered protectively, brushing hair from the boy's forehead, whispering something only a father would understand. And I realized something I wasn't prepared to admit. Jonah wasn't just a good man. He was a man broken in the tender way that makes you want to hold every piece together. And he had no idea that one slipped sentence had just told me everything I needed to know about the depth of his heart, or how dangerous that knowledge might become for mine. By noon, the storm had softened into a slow, drifting haze, and Micah's fever seemed to settle just enough that I thought he might benefit from real medicine instead of my improvised remedies. I told Jonah we could try walking to the small general store in town before it got dark. He hesitated, glancing at the boy wrapped in my grandmother's quilt. Are you sure? He asked, his voice threaded with worry. We won't be long, I said. They'll have children's fever reducers. He needs them. Jonah finally nodded. Together we bundled Micah up, Jonah carrying him close to his chest while I locked the cabin door behind us. The snow crunched under our boots, the world muffled and bright. From a distance, our footprints looked like a path carved through untouched white, a narrow line tying the three of us together. For a strange second, it felt like something I wanted to freeze in place. But that illusion collapsed the moment we stepped into town. The general store sat at the far end of Main Street, but before we could even reach the door, several of the townspeople turned to stare. Whispering, elbowing each other, not subtle, not kind. They had always seen me a certain way, the poor girl in the cabin, the one whose mother left, whose father drank himself into oblivion, who couldn't keep steady work long enough to climb out of the hole people said I had been born in, and now seeing me walk with a strange man and a sick child only added fuel to the assumptions they loved to make. Mrs. Hinder leaned toward her husband and muttered something loud enough for me to hear. I told you, this is what happens when you let people like her live on the mountain alone. Jonah stiffened beside me. Another voice followed this one sharper. Bringing strange men into her house, with a kid. Disgusting. Heat rose in my neck, shame and anger mixing until my throat felt thick. I kept walking, eyes trained on the store door, but the murmurs grew louder. Figures, someone said. Her mother was no better. That one stabbed deeper than any of the others. It always did. I stopped without meaning to. Jonah shifted Micah in his arms and looked at me. His brows pulled together as if he could feel the wound even before I said a word. Before I could tell him to ignore them, a man I recognized, Carl Benson, stepped forward. He was wide-shouldered, red-faced, always looking for something to criticize. Hey, he said, pointing at Jonah's boots. You two picking up strays now? Jonah blinked, confused. Carl smirked and looked at me. Or maybe this one's always been your type. A few people laughed. Not kindly. Something inside me began to unravel, the old familiar feeling of shrinking, curling into myself, becoming small so they could tower over me with their judgment. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, Jonah stepped forward, shifting Micah to one side so he could stand between me and Carl. His expression didn't change. It wasn't anger. It wasn't intimidation. It was stillness, controlled and deliberate. She opened her door to a father and a sick child. Jonah said, his voice steady and low, "That's not something most people would do. Least of all you." Carl faltered, stunned, silent. The crowd quieted too. Jonah continued, tone even, but carved with steel. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand anything. She didn't turn us away into the freezing cold. His eyes locked onto Carl's, unblinking. "You think that makes her weak? It doesn't. It makes her better than any of you." The words hit the air like a crack in ice. The whispers stopped. The smug expressions dropped. Mrs. Hinder stepped back. Carl muttered something under his breath but retreated. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, those people, the same ones who had always regarded me with pity or disdain, looked at me with something different. Not exactly respect, but confusion, as if they had never considered the possibility that someone might stand up for me. Jonah turned to me then, not smiling, not grandstanding, just looking, really looking, and I felt something shift between us, something fragile and frightening and warm. "You okay?" he asked quietly. My throat was too tight for words, so I nodded. Jonah reached out with his free hand, touching my elbow gently, guiding me toward the store. Inside, he stayed close while I picked out fever medication, a humidifier packet, and 2 cans of soup. When I reached for my wallet, Jonah shook his head. "You've already done enough," he murmured. "This is mine." I started to protest but stopped when I saw the sincerity in his eyes. The cashier bagged the items, slowly watching us with caution, maybe with shame. When we stepped back into the cold air, Jonah adjusted Micah in his arms and said nothing. Neither did I. But something had changed. Something undeniable. On the walk back, the world felt quieter, the snow softer. Micah slept against Jonah's shoulder. I found myself glancing sideways at Jonah, studying the lines in his face, the shadows under his eyes, the gentleness that seemed to sit in the center of him like a pulse. And for the first time since he'd knocked on my door, I felt a strange flicker of safety, as if his presence anchored something in me I didn't know had been drifting. When the cabin finally came into view, Jonah paused. "You didn't deserve any of what they said," he murmured. I swallowed. "I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be." And there it was, the sentence that cracked something open in me. The world had spent years reminding me who I was. Alone, small, easy to look down on. But Jonah had reminded me of something else. Someone else. Someone I hadn't felt like in a long time. Someone worth standing beside, worth defending. And as he stepped through the cabin door carrying his sleeping son, I knew one thing for certain. The world might have reminded me who I was, but Jonah had just shown me who I could be. The storm had weakened by the time we stepped back into the cabin, but the air inside still held the lingering warmth of the fire and the faint scent of the soup I had heated earlier. Jonah carried Micah straight to the couch, lowering him gently before tucking the quilt around his small frame. The boy stirred, murmuring something incoherent, then fell back into the soft rhythm of sleep. I went to the kitchen, pretending to fuss with the kettle while my heart kept replaying the scene in town. Every word Jonah had said, every stranger who had looked away, every moment I had felt both exposed and protected in a way I wasn't used to. I poured 2 cups of tea to keep myself busy. Jonah joined me after checking Micah's temperature again. He accepted the cup with a quiet thanks and leaned against the counter, eyes, distant shoulders heavy with something I didn't understand yet. "He'll be okay," I said softly, nodding toward the boy. "The fever reducer will help." Jonah nodded but didn't smile. "I hope so." Silence settled between us, not awkward but weighted. Familiar in an odd way, like the quiet between 2 people who had lived too many hard moments and knew better than to fill every space with words. Later, after Jonah had stepped outside to bring in more wood, I cleaned up the cabin, putting things back in place. When I bent to pick up a fallen blanket near the couch, something caught my eye. the edge of an envelope sticking out of Jonah's open backpack. I shouldn't have looked, I knew that, but the glimpse of a logo on the top corner stopped me cold. R&R Industries, one of the biggest corporate names in the state. A company that would never be associated with the man who had shown up drenched and desperate at my door last night. A man who wore worn boots and clothes that had seen too many winters. A man who chopped wood like he'd done it for years, not like someone who belonged in a glass tower of executives. I froze, staring at the envelope. My pulse quickened. Curiosity tugged hard. And before I could talk myself out of it, I pulled the envelope free, just enough to read the header. It wasn't a bill, or junk mail, or anything normal. It was a formal correspondence regarding a board meeting agenda. My hands shook. What was Jonah doing with this? Why would a struggling father living out of a car be holding something that obviously belonged to someone with real power? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I forced myself to slip the envelope back exactly where it was. But my mind was racing, refusing to settle. Something wasn't adding up. Something bigger was hiding behind his tired eyes and quiet voice. When Jonah returned with an armful of wood, I tried to act normal. He shook the snow off his coat and looked at me for a second longer than usual, as if sensing the shift in my energy. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah, I lied too quickly." He studied me for a moment, then turned his attention back to the fire. The crackling wood filled the room with warmth, but I felt cold. That night, after Micah finally fell into a deeper sleep, Jonah stepped outside again. I watched him through the window. He wasn't just checking the weather. He walked a few steps away from the cabin and pulled out his phone, looking around like he didn't want to be heard. He pressed it to his ear. I opened the window just enough to hear fragments of his voice carried by the wind. "I said I needed time." A pause. "No, I'm not coming back until I'm ready." Another pause. His voice grew rough. "You don't decide that for me." When he hung up, he stayed outside a long time staring at the snow like it held the answer to everything he couldn't say. When he finally came back in, I was sitting at the table pretending to read. He gave me a tired half smile and sat across from me. "You look like you want to ask me something," he said. The truth nearly spilled out of me. About the envelope, the phone call, the feeling that Jonah was not who he appeared to be. But something in his eyes stopped me, a deep heaviness, a familiar grief I had seen before in people who had lost too much. Instead, I said, "You looked upset. Outside." He took a slow breath. "Just unfinished business." "Family?" I asked gently. Jonah's jaw clenched. Something like that. The fire popped, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. I looked at him waiting, giving him a chance to say more. After a long stretch of silence, he finally spoke in a voice so low I nearly missed it. "I used to have a life that made sense." His hands tightened around his mug. A wife, a son, a job I thought mattered, and one morning everything I loved was gone. The room blurred a little at the edges. My breath caught. Micah murmured in his sleep from the couch. Jonah closed his eyes, pained. I promised I'd always protect them, but I couldn't protect anyone. He didn't look at me, didn't cry, didn't break. He simply folded in on himself quietly, like a man who'd learned long ago there was no point in asking the world for mercy. I wanted to reach out to touch his hand, but I didn't. He wouldn't have accepted it, not yet. Instead, I whispered, "You're doing the best you can." "Sometimes the best isn't enough," he murmured back. The grief in his voice was a kind I knew too well. A grief you didn't talk about because talking made it real. Later, when he helped adjust the quilt around Micah and turned out the lamp, I watched him move. Gentle, careful, so full of love it hurt to witness. That envelope in his bag burned in my mind. The quiet phone call, the painful sentence he'd let slip about losing everything. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that Jonah wasn't just grieving. He was hiding something that had the power to change everything I thought I knew about him, something I was never meant to see. And whatever it was coming for him. And for me. The next morning, the storm had quieted into a soft drift, the kind that made the world look fragile and temporary, like it could disappear with a breath. Micah was still sleeping when I stepped quietly into the kitchen to start the stove, and Jonah sat at the table with his elbows on his knees, staring at the dying fire as if trying to build himself out of its last embers. I watched him for a moment, taking in the slump of his shoulders, the exhaustion written across his face, the heaviness that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something too large for one person to hold. I poured hot water into 2 mugs, trying to steady my hands. "You should rest," I said gently. Jonah straightened a little but didn't look up. "I'm fine." He wasn't. Anyone could see it. Even the shadows knew. I sat across from him, pushing one of the mugs closer. He didn't reach for it at first. "Last night," I began quietly, "you said you used to have a life that made sense." Jonah's jaw moved as if he were grinding down words he didn't want to spill. Finally, he said, "I shouldn't have said that." "Why?" I asked softly. "Because it isn't your burden." He rubbed the back of his neck, finally lifting his gaze to mine. "You've already done more for us than I had any right to expect." Something painful twisted inside me. "You're not a burden, Jonah." He didn't answer. He just looked away again, like my words were too heavy for him to carry. I waited, letting the silence settle between us in a way that felt both familiar and new. Jonah had told me pieces, fragments, enough to glimpse the cavern of grief inside him, but not enough to understand the shape of it, and not enough to explain the envelope in his bag or the phone call he'd made in the dark. I wanted to help him. I wanted to understand, but he was already folding into himself again, hiding behind walls built from heartbreak and guilt. So I tried something else, something smaller, something that didn't require him to open wounds he wasn't ready to face. "Stay," I said quietly. Jonah blinked. "What?" "You and Micah," I whispered. "Stay here. Just until he's better. You don't have to go back out there. Not yet." His shoulders tensed. "I can't stay here forever." I didn't say forever. I swallowed hard. "Just long enough to catch your breath. Long enough to remember you're allowed to exist without fighting the world every minute." Jonah's lips pressed into a thin line, not cold but conflicted. "Mara," he said softly, "I can't take more from you." "You're not taking," I insisted. "You're surviving. That's different." His eyes flickered with something raw. "People don't help for nothing." "I do." The words came before I could think them through, but I didn't regret them. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression that made my pulse stutter. Not suspicion, not gratitude, something deeper, something that terrified him more than the storm outside. Why, he asked. A simple question, a devastating one. I didn't know how to explain it without exposing too much of myself. So I told the truth. "Because someone should help you," I whispered, "and because you help everyone else." Jonah's eyes softened, then shut for a moment as if absorbing the weight of it. When he opened them again, he exhaled slowly. "I can't stay," he said, not harshly, not angrily, with resignation. The kind of resignation that came from years of choosing solitude over the risk of losing someone again. "I don't want Micah to get too comfortable." He continued, looking toward the couch where the boy slept. "Or to think this is his home." The sadness in his voice caught me off guard. "It could be," I whispered. Jonah froze. The room stilled around us. Even the fire seemed to quiet. His voice, when it came, was barely a breath. "Don't say things you don't mean." "I mean it," I said, swallowing the ache in my chest. "I know we barely know each other, but last night, the way you cared for him, the way you stood up for me, it felt like something I hadn't had in a long time." Jonah rose abruptly, pacing toward the window as if he needed distance to breathe. Snow dusted the glass, glowing in soft morning light. His reflection looked fractured. "I can't be that person," he whispered. "Not now, not after everything." I stood too, moving closer but giving him space. "You don't have to be anything. Just stay long enough to heal." He turned finally, eyes dark, with something that made my heart squeeze. "I am trying not to want that." I inhaled sharply. The confession hit me harder than I expected. "Why?" He shook his head. "Because wanting anything," he whispered, "hurts." The truth in that sentence shattered me. He wasn't pushing me away because he didn't trust me. He was pushing me away because he didn't trust himself to survive losing something again. Or someone. I stepped forward, hesitant but steady. "Jonah," I said softly, "you're allowed to let someone stand beside you." His voice cracked. "People who stand beside me get hurt." Before I could answer, Micah stirred on the couch, coughing softly. Jonah turned immediately, instinctively, his entire body shifting toward the boy like a compass finding north. He knelt beside him, brushing damp hair from his forehead. His hands trembled. Mine did too. I watched them, father and son, framed by morning light and pain and love, and I realized then that Jonah wasn't rejecting me. He was protecting me. From himself. From whatever life he had walked away from whatever he feared he would bring into mine. And it broke something in me to know he saw himself as a danger instead of a gift. When Micah settled again, Jonah looked up at me from the floor, eyes wet with a grief he didn't bother to hide this time. "You're kind," he whispered. "Too kind. I don't know how to accept that." I knelt beside him. "Then let me teach you." Jonah stared at me, breath unsteady, as if he wanted to believe me but couldn't risk it. He opened his mouth to speak, but whatever he was going to say vanished when he caught sight of the window. His entire body went rigid. A single vehicle was pulling into the snow-covered path that led to my cabin. A black SUV, sleek, quiet. Too polished for this town. Too intentional. Jonah's voice dropped to a rasp. "We're not safe here anymore." And in that moment, I understood. He hadn't just been struggling. He had been running. The black SUV rolled to a slow, deliberate stop at the bottom of the path, its headlights cutting through the last strands of morning fog like two sharp white blades. My breath snagged in my chest. Jonah's reaction was immediate and visceral. His shoulders locked. His hands curled into fists at his sides. And his eyes, normally dark with exhaustion or softened by the presence of his son, sharpened into something I had never seen from him before. Fear. Not the kind that made people freeze, but the kind that made them calculate. Survive. Protect. "Jonah," I whispered through the air in my lungs had already thinned. He didn't look away from the window. "Get Micah's coat," he said, voice low and steady in a way that made my heart pound harder. "Now." The authority in his tone was so unlike the gentle man who had tucked blankets around his sick son that I didn't question him. I turned and grabbed the small puffy jacket draped over the arm of the couch, moving quickly to help Micah into it. The boy was still groggy, rubbing sleep from his eyes, unaware of the tension filling the room like smoke. "Daddy," he murmured. "What's happening?" Jonah crouched beside him, zipping the coat and smoothing his hair back with trembling hands. He tried to steady. "We might have to go soon, buddy. Stay close to me." "Okay," Micah whispered, leaning into his father's touch. When Jonah stood again, his height seemed larger, his presence sharper, as if he had been pulled taut from the inside. He crossed to the window, peering through the edge of the frost-covered glass. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "And whatever happens, let me do the talking." I swallowed hard. "Who are they?" Jonah didn't answer. Instead, he closed his eyes for one slow second, exhaled shakily, and opened them again. "People I didn't want to find us." A cold ripple ran down my spine. The SUV door opened. A man in a dark coat stepped out. Confident, purposeful. He wasn't armed, at least not openly, but everything in his posture screamed authority. Not small town, not local, something else, something bigger. Something that didn't belong in front of a worn cabin in the mountains. He walked up the path toward us. Jonah moved in a single smooth motion, positioning himself between the door and me. Between danger and home. Between the past and the fragile safety we had built in 48 strange, tender, storm-soaked hours. The knock was firm. I flinched anyway. Jonah steadied his breath and opened the door just wide enough to step outside, leaving only a thin crack of air between us. But I could still see him. Rigid spine, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the stranger. "Jonah Hale," the man said in a tone that was not hostile but absolute. Jonah didn't respond, didn't confirm, didn't deny. The man continued. "We've been trying to reach you." You've ignored every call, every message. Jonah's voice was cold. That was the point. The man exhaled, glancing past Jonah toward the cabin's warm light. You can't disappear forever. Not with your responsibilities. Jonah's shoulders tightened dangerously. My responsibilities, he repeated, voice low, are inside that cabin. The man looked confused for a fraction of a second, then recalibrated. Jonah, the board is concerned. You vanishing without notice. Leaving the company mid-quarter. The press is speculating. Investors too. I froze. My pulse hammered as realization crept in like a rising tide. Company, board, investors. This wasn't a debt collector. This wasn't a friend. This was something else entirely. Was this what Jonah had been running from? A job, a corporation, a mess of money and power. I couldn't even imagine. Jonah stepped closer to the man, lowering his voice in a way that made my skin prickle. Tell them I'm alive. That's all they need to know. It's not enough, the man insisted. They want you back. The shareholders, Jonah snapped. Not loudly, not violently, but sharply enough that the man recoiled. I don't care what they want. I had never heard Jonah speak like that. It carved something open inside me. I am not leaving him, Jonah said, gesturing toward Micah through the gap in the door. And I am sure as hell not stepping back into a world that only remembers me when it needs something from me. The man stared at him with something like pity. You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly. Jonah's voice dropped to a whisper made of pure steel. I've never thought clearer in my life. Then the man tried a different angle. His gaze swept into the cabin, landing on me for half a second. It was enough to make chills race down my back. You brought someone into this, he asked. Jonah shifted instantly, blocking me from view completely. She has nothing to do with this, he growled. So leave her out of it. My breath caught. He was protecting me. Again. Fiercely. Instinctively. The man lifted his hands. Look, Jonah, I'm not here to force you. I'm asking. Come back for one meeting, one conversation, just to stabilize things. After that, do whatever you want. Disappear again if you need to. But right now, the company is hanging by a thread. Jonah didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. The silence stretched long enough to hurt. Finally, he spoke each word measured. I'll think about it. The man nodded slowly, as if that was the most he could hope for. I'll send a car. Don't, Jonah said instantly. If I come, I'll come on my own. The man accepted it with a tired sigh and walked back down the snowy path. The SUV pulled away. The forest swallowed the engine noise. Jonah closed the door, and then he just stood there, hands braced against the wood, shoulders trembling, the weight of a world I didn't know existed crushing him silently. I stepped toward him carefully. Jonah. He didn't turn. You heard all that, he whispered. Enough, I answered. Slowly he faced me. His eyes were raw, haunted, full of something that looked like apology, and something that looked like fear, and something that looked like the truth finally breaking free. I didn't want you to know, he said. Know what? His voice cracked. Who I really am. My breath caught. Then tell me. He inhaled shakily as if preparing for impact. My name isn't Jonah Hale, he whispered. It's Jonah Rallings. The name meant nothing to me at first. Then a memory flashed. A brand name printed on a medicine bottle I kept in my cabinet. A logo on the back of a box of medical supplies. A headline I'd skimmed last year. Rallings Industries announces expansion. The words died in my throat. Jonah nodded with a grief-strained expression. I'm the CEO they've been searching for. The air left my lungs. Jonah looked at me like he expected me to step back. Instead, I stepped closer. He flinched. I didn't lie to you, he whispered. I just didn't want to be him anymore. My heart ached. Who were you trying to be? His voice broke. Someone who deserved your kindness. I shook my head. You already did. Jonah swallowed hard, eyes shining. Mara, he whispered, I'm terrified. Of what? His answer was almost silent. That you'll walk away now that you know the truth. I took a breath that felt like the last piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Jonah, I whispered, stepping close enough for him to feel it. You walked into my life in a storm. I'm not leaving just because the sky finally cleared. His eyes closed for one trembling second, and then everything changed. The morning after Jonah's confession should have felt like clarity, like a storm breaking open into sunlight, but instead, everything inside me felt fragile, suspended, waiting to shatter with the slightest touch. Jonah barely slept. I knew because every time I blinked awake, he was sitting by the cold fireplace, elbows on his knees, staring at the dying embers as if they held the answers to a life he no longer recognized. He left before dawn with a quiet promise to return before noon, saying he needed to meet with someone from his company, maybe settle things, maybe make them stop chasing him. I watched through the frosted window as he walked down the snowy hill, Micah asleep in his arms, the rising sun turning the snow under his boots into pale sheets of gold. Then he disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the world he came from. I waited. At first, I kept busy, cleaned dishes, cut wood, boiled tea. But the silence felt different now, louder, deeper, as if the cabin itself sensed something slipping through the cracks. By late morning, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows, whispering warnings I didn't know how to interpret. Jonah didn't return. By noon, the knot in my stomach had tightened so much I couldn't drink the tea I had prepared hours earlier. By 2, the quiet turned suffocating. By 3, I couldn't sit still. I paced, checked the window, stepped outside, walked down the path until snow filled my boots. Nothing. Not a sound. Not a shadow. Not a footprint. The world felt abandoned. Just when fear began to scrape at the back of my throat, I saw something in the road. Something small, dark, half buried in snow. I walked toward it with trembling steps. A glove. Micah's glove. The one with faded blue stripes and a tiny stitched dinosaur on the wrist. It looked like it had fallen recently, still soft, still warm when I picked it up. My heartbeat thundered so loudly it drowned out the wind. And then, my phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number flashed across the screen. I answered instantly. "Hello," static crackled, then a voice snapped through the line. A voice I recognized, my supervisor from the library. "Mara, I'm so sorry. I tried calling earlier, but the signal on the mountain is terrible." "What is it?" I asked, my voice tight. "Your position." "It's been cut," she said softly. "State budget changes. The whole branch is shutting down." Today was the last day. The snow around me suddenly felt sharper, like shards of ice slicing against my skin. "I don't understand," I whispered. "You told me I had at least another month." "I know," she said. "I fought for it. I really did. But there's nothing left to fight. We're all out." A pause. "I'm sorry, Mara. You were one of the best we had." I barely heard the rest. My mind spun crashing into walls made of fear and exhaustion and something heavier than both. By the time I hung up, my legs felt numb as if the ground beneath me wasn't solid anymore. I trudged back to the cabin, every step heavier than the last. I shut the door behind me, leaned against it, and breathed in the emptiness of the room. My hands shook as I lit the fire. I needed warmth. I needed something steady, something familiar. But the flames that rose were thin, flickering uncertainly, as if even they weren't sure they belonged anymore. A loud crack split through the air, then another. I ran toward the sound and found it in the pantry. The last of my wood planks had warped from the cold. The shelves were almost bare. A few cans, half a loaf of bread, tea, a single jar of peanut butter, and less than $10 in my wallet. My throat tightened. I opened the drawer where I kept bills. They spilled out like accusations, overdue notices, disconnection warnings, rent reminders. Everything I had been juggling with thin hope and long nights was unraveling in my hands. I sank onto the floor, clutching the papers, my breath shaking, as if my body couldn't remember how to hold itself together. A gust of wind slammed against the door, rattling the frame so violently I flinched. A tear slid down my cheek before I even realized I was crying. Then another and another, and it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was the quiet kind of crying people only do when they are absolutely alone. The kind that shakes the soul, not the body. I wiped my face angry at myself for falling apart, but the truth pressed harder than anger. I had nothing left. No job, no savings, no family, no future I could see from here. And Jonah was gone, maybe for good. I forced myself to stand, though my knees trembled. I grabbed my coat and stepped out onto the porch again, scanning the forest for any sign of life. The sky was darkening quickly, swallowing the last of the daylight. Snow began to fall in thin, delicate flakes, drifting slowly at first, then faster. My breath fogged the air. "Please," I whispered to the empty world. "Just let me see them. Let me know they're okay." The wind answered with nothing. I hugged myself against the cold and walked back inside. The fire had nearly died again. I knelt in front of it, feeding the last small pieces of wood into the flames. It wasn't enough. Not for warmth, not for hope, not for the life I had been trying so desperately to hold together. The flames popped weakly. Shadows lengthened along the walls. My hands curled into fists. "I shouldn't have let him leave," I whispered. "I should have asked more, should have said something." Silence answered again, heavy and absolute. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against my hands, letting the exhaustion crash over me. For the first time since the storm, the cabin didn't feel like a refuge. It felt like the last fragile piece of a life slowly caving in. I closed my eyes. "Jonah." I breathed, not knowing if it was a prayer or a plea. "Please come back." But the night only grew colder, and nothing came. The next morning I woke up on the floor. At some point during the night, the fire had died and the cold had crawled into my bones like a warning I could not ignore. My eyes felt swollen heavy, as if the weight of everything I had lost had settled behind them and refused to leave. Dawn filtered through the frost-covered windows in a pale gray wash. Quiet. Too quiet. I pushed myself up slowly, wrapping my arms around my body because even the air inside the cabin felt sharp against my skin. I checked outside again, desperate enough to hope for a miracle, even a small one. No footprints, no sound. No sign of Jonah or Micah. Just an endless stretch of untouched snow like the world had erased them entirely. I closed the door with shaking hands. Something inside me shifted hard and painful, as if a final thread had snapped. There was no money, no job, no warmth, no Jonah, and no reason to believe anything good was coming. That was when I heard it, a soft rustle, a whisper of paper sliding against wood. I froze. The sound came from directly under my front door. I stepped toward it slowly, almost afraid to breathe, afraid this, whatever this was, would disappear if I moved too quickly. A cream envelope lay on the floor, thick, expensive, embossed with a subtle silver border that shimmered when the light hit it. For a long moment, I just stared at it. No one came up this mountain. No one had reason to. No mail carrier, no neighbors, no friends. No one but... My heart began to thud painfully against my ribs. I reached down and picked up the envelope with trembling fingers. It was heavier than normal envelopes, as though it carried something more than paper inside. Something deliberate. Something meant for me. My name was written across the front in elegant handwriting so beautiful it almost didn't look real. Mara Thompson. No return address. No stamp. Someone had placed it by hand. My breath caught. I tore the top edge open carefully and slid the paper out. The first thing I saw was the letterhead. R&R Holdings. My stomach dropped, then lifted, then twisted into something too tangled to name. The words below blurred until I blinked hard enough to make them steady again. "Dear Miss Thompson, you are formally invited to a private interview for the position of Community Outreach Coordinator under the R&R Foundation. Your name was personally recommended. Transportation has been arranged on your behalf. Please arrive at the time listed below. Sincerely, Jonah R., Chief Executive Officer, R&R Holdings. My knees weakened so abruptly that I had to grab the table to stay upright. I read the letter again, then again. Jonah. Jonah had found me. Jonah had chosen me, recommended me, wanted me to come to him. 100 questions crashed inside me all at once. Why now? Why after disappearing? Why this job? Why me? And why did reading his name make something warm and painful break open inside my chest? I pressed the letter to my heart, breathing hard as if the words could slip away if I didn't hold them tightly enough. Then I saw it. A second paper tucked behind the first, smaller, handwritten, in Jonah's unmistakable script. Mara, I am sorry for leaving the way I did. I needed time to face the people who tried to take everything from me after my family died. I needed to finish something before I came back to you. You opened your door to me when I had nothing. Now I am opening mine to you. Please come, Jonah. My vision blurred instantly. I pressed a hand to my mouth to hold in the sound that rose there, a broken, relieved half-sob that had nowhere else to go. He wasn't gone. He hadn't abandoned me. He was reaching out, to me. I folded the note carefully as though it could tear from being touched too roughly, then slipped it back into the envelope. My pulse raced, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't fear driving it. It was something fragile and bright, something like hope. I ran to my small bedroom, pulled out the only decent coat I had brushed snow from my boots, and tied my hair back. My reflection in the cracked mirror didn't look impressive. I looked exhausted, pale. My eyes were rimmed red from the night before, but I didn't care. This wasn't about appearance. It was about a door, opening a door I had never expected. Outside, the wind had calmed. The sky was still cloudy but lighter, less threatening. A different kind of cold. I stepped onto the porch just as an engine rumbled up the road. A sleek black SUV appeared through the trees, tires crunching over fresh snow. Someone had come for me. Someone Jonah had sent. I stood frozen, unable to move, until the car stopped in front of the cabin. A driver stepped out, dressed in a dark coat, polished shoes, despite the snow. He gave me a polite nod. Miss Thompson. Yes, I whispered. Mr. Rivera is expecting you in the city by noon, he said. Shall we? I hesitated only a heartbeat before locking the cabin door behind me and climbing into the back seat. As the car rolled away, I looked back at the cabin, shrinking into the distance. The place where everything had fallen apart, and the place where everything had begun. My hands trembled in my lap, but not from fear this time. From the certainty that whatever waited for me at the top of that gleaming glass tower, whatever Jonah wanted to say, whatever this invitation meant, my life was no longer collapsing. It was shifting, opening, becoming something else entirely. The horizon brightened as we drove. Snowflakes softened, trees parted, and for the first time in a long time I dared to believe that light was returning. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and for a moment I couldn't move. The entire 32nd floor shimmered with soft gold light reflecting off glass walls and polished steel. Nothing like the world I came from. Nothing like the silence of my cabin in the snow. I stepped out slowly, my boots almost too loud against the marble, and followed the receptionist who guided me down a long hallway toward a set of double doors. She opened them with a quiet push, and there he was. Jonah stood by the window, his back to me, his hands clasped loosely behind him as he stared down at the city far below. He looked calm, composed, absolutely sure of himself in a way that made my breath catch. But when he turned, when his eyes met mine, every bit of that CEO armor cracked. His shoulders softened, his mouth parted as if he had forgotten how to speak. Mara, he said my name, sounding different on his tongue, softer than it ever had in my cabin, almost reverent. You came. I swallowed hard. You asked me to. Something flickered across his expression, something that looked almost like relief, almost like fear. He motioned toward the small sitting area by the window, and I walked carefully, aware of every inch of space between us, aware of my heartbeat thudding against my ribs. When I sat, he took the chair across from me, but not before looking at me the way someone looks at something they've lost and then somehow found again. It made my chest tighten. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I waited because I had no idea what to say, and he waited because he looked like he had too many words and not enough breath to speak them. Finally, he exhaled. "There's a lot I owe you," he said, voice low. "More than I know how to explain." I shook my head. "I didn't do anything." "You did?" he said quickly. "Mara, you don't understand. That night when you opened your door, you didn't just give us shelter. You gave me something I thought was gone forever." I felt something shift inside me, something trembling and afraid to settle. "Jonah," I whispered, "why did you leave the way you did without saying anything, without even letting me say goodbye?" His jaw tightened as though the question hurt him physically. He looked down at his hands, working one thumb over the other. "Because caring about you scared me." I froze. The world outside the window tilted slightly, and it took a long moment before I could trust my voice again. "Why would caring about me scare you?" He looked up slowly, and every bit of pain he had tried to hide since the night he arrived at my cabin rose to the surface all at once. Because the last time I cared about someone, I lost everything. My wife, my son, my home, my life. I didn't think I had the right to feel anything for anyone again. I could barely breathe. He continued, voice roughening at the edges. "I didn't plan to show up at your door that night. I didn't plan for the storm. Or for Micah to get sick. Or for you to be the one person who opened a door for us when no one else would have." He swallowed hard. "And I definitely didn't plan on caring about you." Heat rose up my throat, not embarrassment, but something deeper, something like recognition. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes locked with mine. "You have no idea what you did for us, Mara." Micah smiled that night in the cabin. He laughed. It was the first time in months I had seen him do either. He felt safe. He felt home. My eyes burned instantly. "But why leave?" I whispered. "Why disappear?" He shut his eyes briefly. "Because I knew if I stayed one more day, I wouldn't want to leave at all. And I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to hope again. I wasn't ready to risk losing someone else." I pressed my palms into my knees to keep them from shaking. "Jonah, I never asked anything from you. That's the problem," he said quietly. "You asked for nothing and you gave everything. You didn't want my money, my name, my life. You only cared that my son could breathe. You only cared that a man in a storm didn't freeze." He paused as though searching for the right words. "I left because I was afraid of what that meant." The silence between us deepened, thick and trembling like a held breath. He finally reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded paper. He placed it on the table between us, but kept his fingers on it. "Micah drew this the morning we left," he said. "He told me to keep it so I would remember the angel who opened the door." My throat closed. I knew what it was before he even lifted his fingers. It was the drawing. My doorway glowing gold, the boy in his arms, the snow around us. And me, the woman who opened the door. I reached out slowly, touching the edge of the paper with one fingertip, afraid it might slip away the way everything else had. Jonah's voice turned softer, then almost uncertain. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again. Not after the way I left." I looked up. "I waited for you," I said before I could stop myself. His eyes widened, filling with something raw and unguarded. "Mara," he breathed. His voice shook for the first time since I met him. "I came because I'm not running anymore." My heart thudded hard enough that I pressed a hand against my chest. "And what are you doing?" He leaned closer, close enough that I could see the storm in his eyes and the hope fighting to break through. "I'm choosing you," he said. "If you'll let me." The words sliced through every bruise life had ever left on me, not to wound, but to lay them open to the light. I didn't know what the next day would bring. I didn't know if I deserved any of this. But I knew one thing: he wasn't running, and neither was I. The gala hall shimmered with thousands of tiny lights suspended from the high glass ceiling, glowing like captured stars. People in elegant gowns and tailored suits moved across the polished floor with the kind of quiet confidence I had only ever seen in movies. I stood near the edge of the room, clutching a small notepad like it was some sort of shield. My dress, simple navy with sleeves that brushed my wrists, felt too plain against all the sequins and silk. My shoes pinched slightly. My breath kept catching in my throat. This world was not mine. But I was here because Jonah wanted me here, because the foundation we were building together demanded we step into this stage for the first time. The Open Door Initiative. My program. Our program. I felt the weight of that reality settle over me like warm fabric, even as insecurity tried to curl its cold fingers around my spine. Across the room, Jonah stood surrounded by board members and donors, tall and composed in his charcoal suit. He caught my eye through the crowd, and for a heartbeat, everything in the room slowed. He didn't smile. He didn't have to. His eyes told me exactly what I needed to know. I'm here. You're not alone. My lungs loosened enough for me to breathe. I exhaled and nodded back. A soft voice next to me broke the moment. Miss Thompson, they're ready for you. I turned to the event coordinator, her headset blinking under the lights. Ready for me. My palms started to sweat. I followed her to the stage steps, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. When I reached the podium, the room dimmed slightly and a spotlight warmed my shoulders. The host introduced the program in broad strokes, then gestured toward me. This initiative would not exist without the insight of one woman who understands what it means to open a door when no one else will. I stepped forward. My throat tightened, but I forced my voice steady as I spoke about rural towns, about people forgotten by the system, about nights without heat and nights with too much fear. I told them that kindness without conditions changes lives. I told them that sometimes the smallest door can save someone who has nowhere else to go. I never mentioned Jonah. I never mentioned the storm. I never mentioned the cabin or the black card or the moment I thought I had lost him forever. Some stories belong to the heart, not a stage. When I finished the room, applauded politely, warmly, but a few seconds later I noticed something shifting in the crowd. Two reporters whispered to each other near the press line. A woman with a clipboard tilted her head toward me and smirked, and then a voice broke through the noise. Miss Thompson. I turned a microphone thrust toward me before I could even breathe. Is it true, the reporter asked, her tone sharp as winter ice, that your sudden rise in R&R is due to personal involvement with Mr. Rivera? The air drained from my lungs. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. Some sources, she continued, are saying that a woman with no degree, no background in philanthropy, and no corporate experience could not possibly have earned this position on merit alone. Would you say Jonah Rivera is helping you in other ways? Heat slapped across my face. My fingers tightened around the podium. A ringing filled my ears, drowning out the whispers around me. I could feel eyes on me, judging, dismissing, ready to tear apart the one thing in my life I had finally built. I swallowed hard. I was offered this position because of... Before I could finish, a hand touched the small of my back gently but firmly. Jonah stepped beside me. Not behind me, not in front of me, beside me. The room fell silent instantly. His presence changed the air, grounding it, steadying me. He looked at the reporter with calm, unshakable clarity. If I may, he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He placed his other hand over mine on the podium, fingers warm and steady. Then he turned to the room. The woman standing here did not rise because of me. She rose despite me. A ripple in the audience. He continued, when I had nothing left, when I had lost everything that mattered, when the world walked past me without a second glance, she opened her door to my son and me. No questions, no judgment, no expectation of reward. His voice softened, though it carried farther than any microphone. She did not know my name. She did not know my position. She saw two people in need and acted from pure compassion. I was not helping her. She was helping me. My vision blurred. I felt my chest tighten with so much emotion I could barely breathe. Jonah looked at me, then really looked in front of everyone with a tenderness that stripped away every rumor, every doubt, every cruel assumption. Everything you see here tonight, he said to the crowd, exists because of her heart. And if anyone questions her qualifications, let me be clear. She is the reason this foundation has a soul. Silence. Then applause. It started softly in the back, then spread across the room in rising waves. I felt my knees weaken slightly, but Jonah tightened his hand around mine in a silent promise that he would not let me fall. After the applause faded and the lights dimmed to their gentle glow, he guided me off stage, not releasing my hand even once. We walked until we reached a quiet corner of the hall, away from the cameras and the eyes that had followed us moments before. I finally found my voice shaky but real. "You didn't have to say all that." Jonah turned toward me, his features soft in the warm light. "Yes," he said quietly. I did. His thumb brushed the back of my hand. "You stood alone long enough, Mara." My breath caught. Not anymore. The snow had returned in a soft hush that morning, drifting over the old pine trees like a memory trying to land gently. I stood at the edge of the clearing with Jonah's hand in mine, and Micah bounding through the fresh powder ahead of us, leaving tiny boot prints behind him like a trail leading home. My heart clenched when I saw the cabin again, the same worn wood and crooked porch, the same chimney leaning just slightly to the left. But it did not feel like the lonely shell I once lived in anymore. It felt like an echo that had been waiting for this moment, for this return, for this full circle I had never imagined possible. The front door creaked when I opened it, the same long sigh it had given the night a stranger nearly collapsed against it with his sick son in his arms. Back then, it had felt like an accident. Now it felt like a beginning I was always meant to step into. The windows were clearer now, the beams stronger, the floor patched and warm. Jonah had insisted on helping me restore it these past months, saying that some places deserved a second life just as much as people did. He stepped inside behind me, brushing snow from his shoulders, his breath fogging in the cool air. Micah ran straight to the fireplace and dropped his stuffed moose next to the hearth like he had lived here his entire life. I knelt to help him with his coat. When I looked up, Jonah was watching us, his eyes soft in a way that made my chest tighten. There was a long quiet before he finally said, "Feels different now, doesn't it?" I nodded. "It feels like it finally belongs to someone." He stepped closer. "It belongs to you." But I shook my head gently. "It belongs to all of us now." Something flickered in his expression at that something deep and fragile and full of hope. We spent the morning unpacking groceries, lighting the fire, filling the rooms with the scent of cinnamon tea and fresh bread. Micah built a tower of wooden blocks beside the couch, humming to himself, while Jonah strung soft yellow lights along the window frames. I kept turning toward them without meaning to, just to memorize the sight, the sound, the warmth. I had lived so long in silence that I had forgotten homes could breathe when filled with the right people. In the late afternoon, the three of us stepped outside again, wrapped in coats and scarves. The sky had turned gold sunlight stretching in long ribbons across the snow. Micah rushed ahead, shouting, "Come see! Come see!" We followed the small prints he left behind until he stopped at the porch steps and pointed at something taped to the door. It was a small piece of paper. I recognized the handwriting instantly. His handwriting. The one he had used the night he left that first message on my kitchen table, the one that had broken me and saved me in the same breath. I reached for it slowly, my fingers trembling without knowing why. The paper was blank except for 6 simple words. The same 6 he had once whispered to me in a moment he thought I was asleep. The same 6 I had carried in my heart even when he was gone. "Thank you for opening the door." A breath escaped me uneven and warm in the cold air. When I turned, Jonah was already kneeling. Not dramatically, not perfectly. Just honestly, one knee sinking slightly into the snow as he held out a small velvet box that looked too humble to belong to a millionaire CEO. Inside was a silver ring, simple and unpolished, like something shaped by hand instead of machine. The inside of the band was engraved with a tiny door, just barely visible light spilling from the crack in the engraving as if alive. Jonah looked up at me with an expression I had never seen from him before. Not sorrow, not fear, not the steady calm he used to hide behind, but something open, something unguarded, something that felt like the answer to the question I had been too afraid to ask. His voice was quiet when he spoke. I used to think love was something that belonged to my past, something I had already lived and lost. But you, he swallowed, visibly shaken. You taught me that grief doesn't mean the story is over. It means the next chapter needs more courage. My vision blurred. He continued, You let Micah feel safe again. You let me feel like a father again. You let this place become a home again. The wind swept softly around us as if urging him on. So I am standing here on the same porch where you saved us, asking you something I never thought I would ask anyone again. He lifted his hand slightly toward me. Will you keep the door open for us? For a lifetime. Behind him, Micah clasped his hands together, eyes wide and bright. Say yes, Mara. Please say yes. A laugh burst out of me, cracked and watery, because somehow this little boy had been the thread sewing both of us back together. I knelt down in the snow across from Jonah, cupping his shaking hands in mine. I opened the door one night, I whispered, voice breaking, because you needed help. I leaned forward until my forehead rested gently against his. But I am saying yes now because I need you too. His exhale trembled through both of us. Micah launched himself into our arms, giggling and shouting something about hot cocoa and snow angels and forever families. The three of us stayed like that for a long time, tangled in a moment so bright it felt like the world itself paused to witness it. When we finally stood, Jonah slid the ring onto my hand. It fit as if it had been waiting for that moment all along. I looked at the cabin glowing softly behind us, the lights warm against the deepening blue of evening. And something inside me settled. Something long wandering finally rested. I whispered almost to myself, This is what light feels like. Jonah heard it because he wrapped his arm around me and said it was always there. You just needed someone to reflect it back. As the first stars appeared above the trees, we walked inside together, the three of us. And for the first time, the door did not close behind us. It stayed open, just a crack, letting the light spill out into the snow, a symbol of everything we had become, a family. If this story stayed with you the way that night stayed with me, then maybe it is because somewhere deep inside, you still believe in the same quiet truths I had almost forgotten. That kindness still matters, that people can still surprise you, that even on the coldest nights, someone might knock on your door, not to take something from you, but to remind you that you are still needed in this world. And if you felt even a little of that tonight, then I want you to stay a moment longer with me. Let the world outside slow down. Let the responsibilities, the noise, the headlines all fade for just a breath. Because stories like this do not happen in grand gestures or perfect circumstances. They happen in the small hours, in the soft choices, in the moments when we choose compassion over fear. When we open doors we could have left shut. Maybe you saw a piece of yourself in me alone, but trying anyway. Maybe you saw a piece of yourself in Jonah carrying a weight quietly because he didn't want to burden anyone. Or maybe you saw yourself in Eli, someone who just wanted warmth, safety, and a little bit of hope. Life has a way of wearing down even the strongest hearts. Some of us spend years feeling invisible. Some carry grief that no one else sees. Some spend so much time surviving that we forget what grace feels like. But I am here to tell you this: even the smallest moments of kindness can reroute an entire future. A warm fire on a cold night, a stranger who doesn't ask questions, a child who laughs again. These things matter. You matter. And your story is not done, even if some days it feels like you are standing in the middle of your own storm with no one to open the door for you. Sometimes the door opens anyway. Sometimes healing walks in wearing wet boots and carrying a sleeping child. Sometimes hope returns in ways you never could have predicted. And sometimes when you least expect it, someone sees you. Not your mistakes, not your struggles. You. The person beneath all of it. The person who is still here, still fighting, still choosing to care in a world that often forgets to. If this story touched you tonight, if it reminded you of what your own heart has survived, then I hope you stay with us. Because here in this little corner of the internet, we tell stories that lift that warm, that bring breath back to tired souls. Stories that remind us that it is never too late for a second chance, never too late for a new beginning, never too late for a door to open that changes everything. And if you are still reading these words, maybe that is your sign. Maybe something in you is ready for hope again, ready for softness. ready to believe in goodness not as a weakness, but as a strength that carries us through the hardest winters of our lives. So stay for the next story. Stay for the warmth. Stay for the reminder that even in the quiet, even in the dark, you are not alone. And if you want more moments like this, more nights where your heart feels just a little bit lighter, then you are welcome here. Truly, deeply welcome. Let's keep going together. The next story is waiting for you.